Good day. We are back again. This is the Catholic Lady, and we are reading Great Lion of God by Taylor Caldwell. Taylor Caldwell wrote a number of books during her lifetime, and Great Lion of God is one that I read in the 70s. Excuse me, she wrote it in 1970, and I read it sometime during the 70s. And it's out of print at the moment, but if you search hard, you may be able to find a used copy somewhere, and perhaps one day someone will reprint it. We're on chapter 5 now, and at this point, Hillel has grown to a young man. He had his first experience with a woman and was traumatized by it. Due to his great fear of God and his teachings, regarding that, and his own disposition. So at that point, he had begun to despise women. And again, this is a book of fiction based on truths. So this is a story leading up to the idea of what his personality was like. And so we'll begin with chapter 5. The family of Hillel ben Baruch had intended to leave for Jerusalem and the marriage of Sephora after Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights, which coincided this year with the Roman Saturnalia and the celebrations of various other gods. Tarsus was very festive and never appeared to sleep in these days, and torches flared all night in their sockets on the walls, and the streets resounded with music, and cymbals and drums and flutes and laughter and running feet, and the cries of women and the warning shouts of guards who were also drunk. A ship from Greece came into the port of Tarsus, a small merchant vessel loaded with resinous wine, which the Greeks of the city preferred to all other wines. But it did not unload, though it lay at anchor for several days. On the 4th day, it inconspicuously raised the yellow flag and put out to sea, and the Roman centurions looked after it in the pallid dawn light and cursed it, and shook their fists at it and prayed silently. Their captain warned them not to speak of this to any other, and the soldiers, feeling for the sacred metal strung about their necks on chains, saluted and fell into line and marched away, iron soles clanging on the polished black stones of the street. But though the vessel had been guarded after doctors had examined several of the crew, and all the doors had been bolted and galleys locked, the damage had been done. Several rats had swum ashore in the night, and they carried with them their sickness and the fleas who had caused it. They died before morning in the gutters. The fleas found other hosts among the healthy rats of the city. There were 2 sanitaria in Tarsus. 3 weeks after the Greek and Egyptian physicians knew the dreadful truths, plague was abroad in the city. They consulted together. Should the people be told of the danger and warned to leave Tarsus, thus possibly carrying the infection with them? Should the gates be closed and guarded so that none could leave and no man enter the city? In any event, the people would panic and would mill mindlessly, attempt to escape, fight with the guards who tried to restrain them, and eventually they would lose their minds and loot and burn and kill and commit many other crimes. The doctors decided that they would control matters as long as possible and tell no one. Winter was upon the land, and the air was sharp and clear and cold, and the fields and gardens were brown, and the sun was large and pale. The grape-colored mountains blazed with snow, and the river ran in dull silver through the rich valley, and Tarsus smelled of baking bread, roasting meats, and wine in the marketplaces and the taverns and the inns. It was not for some time that it was observed that no ships put into the usually turbulent port, but stood out at sea and loaded boats that came to them, casks of olives and mats of wool, carpets, silks and cottons, wines, beer, whiskies, oil, spices, salt, and other merchandise. No reason was given, even when it was observed that no ships of Tarsus put out to sea. Questions were asked when expected visitors did not arrive. One by one, public buildings were quietly closed. Then, because there were now too many questions and too many rumors, the yellow flag was hoisted over the high Roman guard tower above the harbor, and the people were stricken with terror, and the guards walked the streets all night with naked swords in their hands. Tarsus was by nature riotous and passionate, and for a few days the Romans were strained to their very limits of exhaustion and determination to keep the mindless mobs from too much vandalism and rioting. Terror had the people by the throat. Doors and windows were closed tightly, and the streets began to be deserted except for the thieves and the gatherers of the dead, and the rattling of the death carts over the stones. A putrid stench rose from the gutters. Not even the Romans could force men to clean them and to wash down the streets, even at the threat of imprisonment and death. So the Roman soldiers turned to this task. No one jeered. Fright was too great. The wagons did not come into the city in the mornings, but waited outside the gates, and there left their wares and fled. Only hunger forced men to the gathering and the distribution. And everyone drank mightily and burned incense to the gods, but no one came to the temples. The weather grew colder. The house of Hillel ben Baruch was heated with constantly fed braziers, and woolen curtains, thick and heavy, had been drawn over the windows to keep out the chill winds, and the doors were barred. Deborah, for all her vanity and lightness of mind, was a sensible matron when it concerned her household, and the storehouses were full. The family was fitted to endure a siege, and all knew now that they were indeed besieged by something more fearful than a human foe. It was noticed that not many Jewish funerals appeared on the blank streets. Avid and terrified eyes peered from behind curtains at the funerals of the mean and the mighty, but a few Jews. So evil rumors began to spread. It had long been believed that the Jews were acquainted with magic, and that they would share with no others, and had sorceries against illness, which they kept from their neighbors, so only they could survive. But the physicians in the teeming sanitarium knew that it was the Jews' insistence on absolute cleanliness and their intolerance of vermin that gave them some measure of protection against disease, even against the plague. They became alarmed at the rumors they heard and warned the Roman centurions. The Romans, the most tolerant of conquerors, the most law-abiding, the strongest despisers of tales and passions and disorders, prepared to protect the Jews if necessary, and issued warnings of their own. Those caught looting property would abide by the ancient law. Looters were to be executed immediately. Those guilty of setting fires would be thrown into their own fires, whether gray-beard, child, man, or woman. There was not a street, even in the harsh and brilliant sunlight of the day, that did not have its patrolling soldiers in war dress. The sun glinted on their swords and on dropped visors and on armored chests. The resolute steps of the soldiers resounded from stone, and the voices of their officers were loud in the silent city. The banners of Rome fluttered against the hard blue sky, and the carriers of fasces were everywhere, demonstrating to the people that law was law above all else, and there would be no lawlessness in Tarsus so long as any Roman remained alive. Hillel heard of these things, but did not inform his household. He had no visitors, and he was thankful that he lived in the suburbs. The walls and the floors of his house were washed down at dawn by his servants, each and every morning, and rats and mice hunted mercilessly. All stayed within the house except for necessary excursions into the garden for last fruits and dates and citrons to the storehouses. Fear lived here as it lived in all other houses in the suburbs and the city, but with the fear was mingled prayers. For the infection spread, but the infection spread. Just when the first pale pink blossoms were appearing on the almond trees in the garden, and bare twigs were quickening, and myrtle was budding, Deborah and her son Saul were stricken by the plague. As the household was small and not pretentious, it did not possess a family physician in residence, and physicians were always available from the sanitaria or from their private practices. Hillel, for the first time in his life, mounted a horse and rode into Tarsus. But he would not permit the family carriage to be used, for he would then endanger a slave or a servant who would be driving it, and he feared a chariot. The horses was the least of his anxiety, though he was accustomed to riding an ass when he rode at all, a docile and a patient ass, and not like this horse which, though gelded, moved too rapidly for its master. The Roman soldiers laughed at his disordered passing. Hillel went to the largest of the sanitaria and asked for his friend, the famed Egyptian physician Aramis. While he waited in the cold marble hall, he could hear the screams and moans of the dying in their wards, and he wrapped his cloak tightly about him and closed his eyes and prayed the prayer for departing souls. Then Aramis was beside him, touching his arm, and he dropped the hood of his cloak, and his eyes were full of tears. The Egyptian was very tall and dark and lean, with a thin and prominent Hebraic face. "Dear friend," he said, and he was full of concern, "do not tell me that your family is stricken." Hillel nodded. He could not speak for a moment or two, and then he said, My wife, Deborah Bathsheba, and my only son, Saul, you know them well." "I will come at once," said Aramis, and he went for his pouch, and Hillel tried to control his despair and wait in patience. Aramis returned, cloaked and hooded in gray wool, carrying his pouch. His horse, a fine Arabian steed, was waiting for him at the gate. "I cannot thank you enough," Hillel stammered, as he struggled to rise onto his own horse. He was not adroit. He began to fall over the side of the animal and desperately clutched at its mane. And Aramis's servant caught him and gravely replaced him. Hillel was hardly aware of this. His haggard face was desolate. He stared at the physician mounted high and proud. "Save them," said Hillel. "Save them, and all that I have is yours." They rode through the empty streets, Hillel tossing on his horse and hardly able to control it. Finally Aramis took the reins from his hands and led the horse. He said, "Do not despair. The plague is waning, and those we now see have it in a milder form. Many survive. Before the summer comes, the disease will have left the city." But when he saw Deborah in her carved ebony and ivory bed, he knew she was moribund. She had the plague in its worst form, in her lungs, and her blood dripped from her lips, and she was not conscious. Aramis regarded her with sadness and pity. So beautiful a young woman, and so doomed. He could do nothing for her but relieve her last agony, and so he prepared a potion brewed of opium for her, and told her servants to give spoonfuls of it to her when she could swallow. Then he threw aside the darkening wool curtains and let the wind and sun into the room, so that at the last Deborah could see the sky and be comforted, and not die in dimness and seclusion. He bent over her and again touched her fiery cheek, and she opened dull and unaware blue eyes, already glazed with death. Aramis returned to Hillel, who awaited him in the atrium. The husband and father had been pacing in extreme agitation. He sprang at the physician when he saw him and clutched his arms. He saw on the physician's face what there was to see, and he let his hands and head fall and did not speak. Aramis visited young Saul, who was delirious and tossing wildly on his bed, held there by the strength of 2 men servants. He had the bubonic form, though desperate, held more hope than his mother's affliction. His buboes were leaking pus and blood, and the white linen sheets were stained. But Aramis reflected that the youth was strong and sturdy and of a vital constitution, and had never been ill before. He had a possibility of survival. Aramis gave his orders to the servants, and 2 potions in flasks, and ordered cooling baths scented with verbena. He returned to Hillel and tried to smile. "Pray," he said, "I have hope for Saul, for youth and life are with him." "My wife, my sweetest one, my child," said Hillel, and began to weep. He pulled his shawl over his head and addressed his God with numbed lips, asking for mercy. Aramis remained in the household of his friend until sunset, when Deborah Bathsheba, the child in spirit, the infant in true knowledge, died with one soft and final cry. Aramis put his arm in support about the shoulders of Hillel ben Baruch, who watched a servant gently close the eyes of his wife, and fold her hands on her breast, and then cover her face with the sheet. Hillel began to tremble violently. He pulled his shawl over his head and cried aloud, "The Lord gives, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." His voice broke and his shoulders bent, but he recited in a low and steadfast voice the Psalm of David. "Out of the depths have I called you, O Lord. Lord, hearken my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications. If you, Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? For with you is forgiveness, that you may be feared. I wait for the Lord, my soul doth wait, and in his word do I hope. My soul waits for the Lord, more than watchmen for the morning. Yea, more than watchmen for the morning. O Israel, hope in the Lord. For with the Lord there is mercy, and with him is plenteous redemption." He paused and clasped his white hands together, and said in a louder voice, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Then he could stand no more, but fell on his face beside the bed of his wife. Aramis shook his head in compassionate wonder. He could not understand why a man so deeply stricken by the loss of a beloved could recall his God and adore him, and cry aloud to his people to remember his name. But then he reflected, the Jews were an incredible people, as his own people had reason to remember. None could comprehend them. Their trust in their deity, their meekness before his blows, offended the Egyptian sense of civilization and pride and manliness. His mother had been in her tomb for a number of days before Saul awoke to consciousness, weakness and pain drenching cold sweat. He awoke to the sight of Aramis's face bent over him in the morning light, and the feel of his palm on his forehead. "Saul," said the physician gently, "do you know me, Saul?" The first red rays of the sun were striking on the gleaming white walls of the cubiculum, and the warm, sweet wind of early spring blew out the curtains above the windows. Saul's cracked and parched lips moved in a faint whisper, and Aramis smiled contentedly. The boy would live. He ordered a cool draught for him, half wine and half water, mixed with raw eggs, and held it himself to Saul's mouth and bade him to drink. The youth obeyed, looking fixedly at the Egyptian's face. His own was sunken, and the broad and heavy bones of it were like stone over which gray skin had been stretched. The flesh was gone. Only the red hair had vitality now. The strenuous blue eyes were remote, as if remembering a far place and time. The youth whispered, "I thought I had died." "Not yet," said Aramis, pleased that Saul had swallowed all the draught. "You have defeated death, and you will defeat him again and again." The neck of his tunic had fallen forward, and Saul saw what hung about his throat on a golden chain. And even in his weakness and prostration he was startled, for the object was as long as his middle finger and made of gold, and it was a cross with a looped top which held to the chain. Saul felt a dim astonishment at the sight of this infamous object, this symbol of shameful Roman death, of criminal execution. He could not take his eyes from it, and Aramis, seeing this, touched it with his forefinger. "It is the sign of a man's redemption, given to my people from the ages, the sign of the resurrection of the dead, from everlasting to everlasting." A curious thrill ran through Saul's weakened flesh, but what had caused it he did not know. Yet he thought that he had discerned a flash somewhere like lightning, like the tearing of a fabric which had concealed a blazing lamp. He was still pondering on this strangeness, pain and confusion, mixed with a sense of premonition, when he fell asleep. And it was a sleep undisturbed by nightmares which had haunted him and driven his feeble soul into dark caverns of terror. When his father visited him at sunset, he had vague memories of seeing his face bending like this over him many times during his almost mortal illness. But now he saw clearly. Hillel had aged. The brightness of his hair and beard had paled. His face was thin and filled with suffering. His brown eyes were scored by many tears. When Saul recalled that he had been struck down the day after his mother, he stared at his father, and he knew. Pain took him, pain of the spirit, not for Deborah, but for Hillel, whom he deeply loved. He sought his father's hand weakly, and Hillel's fingers closed over his. Hillel bowed his head, and he repeated, "The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Saul began to weep silently, and again his grief was for his father. Hillel wiped away his tears. "I have my children," he said. "God is good. Blessed be his name." A servant lit a lamp on the table nearby, and its yellow tongue fluttered in the evening wind. Saul turned his head to look at the last light, and it seemed to him that he was no longer a youth, but a man. He had tightened over his father's hand. His heart expanded painfully with love for his tenderest of fathers, but Saul felt that he had the hand of a child, and he did not know why he should feel so, why he desired above all things to protect Hillel. It was many weeks before Saul recovered even a measure of his strength. Never again was he to feel the bodily power of the years before his illness, and the tirelessness of it. From that time henceforth he was driven less by his youth and vital energy, now much depleted, than by the strength of his spirit. He was to know the weakness of the flesh and the weariness of the day he died, and no more did his soul bound in him like a newborn lamb in the morning of life. He had returned from a far place, and had left much behind him, never to be regained. During the weeks of his recovery, he sometimes thought of his mother, but as the days passed he found it hard to recall the beauty of her face and the sound of her voice. This grieved him. He felt himself an unnatural son, that he could not mourn her as a son should mourn. He denounced himself for his lack of sorrow, and forgot that his mother had not loved him. When he stood with his father saying Kaddish, he hated himself for what he believed was his arrant hypocrisy. He wanted to beg his father's forgiveness for lack of sensibility and hardness of heart, but he could not increase Hillel's suffering, and so he recited the prayers for the dead with him. He despised himself because he could not truly believe that his mother's soul had survived her light and trivial existence in this world. She had died as a flower dies, sinking crumbled into the earth, the petals decaying. Women, he would think, were not worthy of the grief of a man, nor his pain. He thought this even when before her tomb, watching his father lay a sheaf of summer flowers upon it. When he thought of Dassel, involuntarily, he would shiver as at the intrusion of evil, and would pray to be delivered from her memory. He considered his sister Sephora less delightful to him, and he was less indulgent with her airiness and mockery, and often found her laughter displeasing. When she cried for her mother, he was impatient and restless. He desired something with a great desiring and a mighty and starving hunger, but what it was that he desired in place of what he had lost, he did not know. And that's the end of chapter 5.